Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to a special town hall edition of Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, president of LPB, and I'm joined by Reverend Raymond Jetson, pastor of Star Hill Church. We've gathered in this place of spiritual healing to discuss how the city and state can move beyond the tragic events of this past July.
Beth, we are so glad that you decided to have this important conversation here at Star Hill. As you know, we are only about a half mile from where Alton Sterling was killed in a controversial confrontation with police.
Well, it was just 12 days after Alton lost his life that 3 of the city's law enforcement officers lost their lives to a lone gunman from Missouri. Over the next hour, we'll have a frank, respectful, and productive discussion on ways to improve trust between the police and the communities they serve. Our moderators will be Robin Merrick with the Southern University System and Bob Mann with LSU's Manship School. First, an overview. Pastor F. Willis Johnson leads the congregation at the Wellspring Church in Ferguson, Missouri. The August 2014 shooting of Michael Brown by police officers affected members of the community differently, Johnson says. He says a person's background and their life experiences influences how he or she processes that incident.
Everyone's tolerance for pain varies. The severity of an injury also will speak to the time that it will take to not only rehabilitate but to be fully at strength.
In Baton Rouge, like in Ferguson, the first step is recognizing that everyone is approaching the situation from a different place.
Unfortunately, sometimes we have to be awakened and stirred, and I pray for your community, as we have in ours, to be a lot more sensory in knowing and seeing and feeling what is happening.
University Presbyterian Church head pastor Patty Snyder is involved with Together Baton Rouge. That's an interfaith organization that has worked toward bridging the city's divide for a number of years.
People are saying this is our chance. This is our chance to address some of the issues that have been stewing in our city for a long time, and hopefully to come together and find some solutions.
Snyder compares Baton Rouge to a simmering pot. The events of last summer have brought the city to its boiling point.
There are issues as far as economic development, access to health care, the standard of public education.
On the surface, it may not be easy to see what economic development has to do with the death of Alton Sterling. Gary Chambers is a community activist and founder of the local publication, The Rouge Collection.
We're in a crisis situation in North Baton Rouge prior to this. You know, two hospitals closed in North Baton Rouge. How many grocery stores and businesses have fleed our community?
Chambers insists that Sterling's life experience would have been different if he and his family were white.
Economic development is a key component to being able to help people get ahead. Black people are not exclusive to going to jail. There are white kids who go to jail too, but they have uncles, aunts who either own companies or sit in positions or know people who own companies that get them the opportunity to be given a second chance.
Together Baton Rouge recently released a study compiling federal surveys about drug use and local arrest data. It showed that Baton Rouge zip codes with larger African-American populations have many more drug arrests, despite the fact that drug use is about equal in predominantly white zip codes. Sterling's death was not the only high-profile shooting this summer. 3 law enforcement officers were killed and another 3 were injured after an ambush by an out-of-state gunman. Lieutenant Robert McGarner leads a group of officers who specialize in community policing. He worries about the perception of cops in the community.
It should be us as the police and the community versus the ones that's causing a problem. That's how the us versus them should be. But we got it, it's not that way right now.
Chambers argues that's difficult to change given how often the media covers excessive use of force incidents.
When you see images like that, how do you teach black children to comply with officers rather than run?
The city's new mayor, Sharon Weston Broome, has instituted several new policies for city police regarding use of force. First, officers are required to give a verbal warning before using deadly force, except in certain circumstances. They are required to de-escalate situations when possible. Chokeholds and strangleholds are prohibited, except in emergencies. Officers must not shoot at a moving vehicle unless there's a fatal threat, and they must intervene if another officer is using excessive force inappropriately. All these practices have been taught in police training, but were not codified in policy. There are exceptions for each rule providing for the safety of the officer. Some Baton Rouge residents also look to community policing to improve relations.
I know there's a lot of officers out there going that extra mile, contacting people. Now, do we need to do it more? Yes, we need to do it more, most definitely. When you have that opportunity, get out your car and speak to someone. Stop at one of your local businesses and meet the manager or the owner and talk to them. And once you start getting that rapport, things get a lot better because it shouldn't be us against them.
So how does Baton Rouge as a community change for the better? Snyder says she hears some of her congregation wish that Baton Rouge could just be like it was before July. That kind of talk is a symptom of white privilege, she says.
And that's normal to feel that way, that you want your comfort back because we all feel uncomfortable. But I think most people realize that the peace that we achieve eventually in the midst of this is going to be a different peace than what we had before. I hope it will be a different peace. I hope it will be a peace that is more broadly shared.
Johnson, the pastor from Ferguson, says Baton Rouge has the chance to be stronger than before, just like someone recovering from a broken bone.
If you break a bone, in theory, when it heals and if it heals properly, you're not to break that bone usually in that same place. There's a strengthening that happens in the healing process. Healing takes on a lot of different shapes and forms, and we have to be willing and wanting to acknowledge and accept those formations.
That starts with conversation.
Well, joining us to help with that conversation are the members of our panel tonight. Father Rick Andrus is the pastor of St. Paul the Apostle Catholic Church and a member of Together Baton Rouge. Prior to his appointment in 2013, he served at St. Elizabeth's in Chicago. Sharon Weston Broome is the first female elected mayor-president of Baton Rouge. She has indicated that she would like to find an innovative police chief for the city who will build community policing into the department. Deputy Chief Darrell Basco is state president of the Fraternal Order of Police. He also serves as the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement and the Body Camera Task Force. State Representative Ted James is a Democrat whose district includes part of North Baton Rouge. James is also co-chair of Mayor Broome's Public Safety Committee. And Stephanie Regal is a veteran print and broadcast journalist who has been editor of the Greater Baton Rouge Business Report for the past 5 years. And now I believe Robin has the first question from a member of our audience.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, indeed, I do. Our first question comes from Gary Chambers, if you wouldn't mind standing. And tell us your name again and who you represent.
Gary Chambers with the Rouge Collection. In the last 72 hours, we've had 2 officers attacked on separate issues, separate incidents, and those officers did not find the need to fire their weapon. The individuals who attacked those officers were arrested, detained. Alton Sterling never attacked the police officers, but he died. Specifically, policy-wise, what have you done in the last 7 months to change Baton Rouge for the better? Because we can talk in dialogues like this, but if there's not policies and procedures in place, then we're just blowing smoke.
Over the last 7 months, I've been involved, first of all, with Mayor Broome's police reform for violence. One of the things that I've done, I'm also very active with Together Baton Rouge, is we are looking forward to ways that we can bridge gaps. Some of the churches are talking very diligently about building better relationships with people. Probably one of the things that I've been a very strong proponent of over time is the community policing incident, because I believe that when there is a better, healthier, stronger relationship between the police and the community, when the police who are in the community know the community and the community know them, I believe that these kinds of incidents will probably not happen as often as they have in the past.
I believe it was the second day that I was in office. I gathered a group of individuals, a diverse group of individuals from our community, including law enforcement as well as citizens, to come together to talk about how indeed we could make some tangible changes as it relates to reform. As many people have indicated, we have a lot of meetings, but people are looking for some substance, some action steps. And so we recognized through that meeting that policy was one way that we could certainly show that there are some tangible steps being taken. And so I'm very glad, with the help of individuals who participated on that advisory council, many in the audience tonight, that we were able to come into agreement as it relates to use of force policy changes. Well, I should say policy additions. Many people said, well, what is that all about? They already teach that in the academy. But I contend, and I believe the individuals who join me also agree, that policy, as you bring up, certainly has a different effect than just training. Policy, for me, is synonymous with accountability. And so I'm very glad that as a new mayor, I was able to bring together people from throughout our community and come up with some tangible policy changes that could be implemented for the police department.
Whenever the events from Baton Rouge happened, from a statewide perspective of being the leader of the Fraternal Order of Police statewide, some of the things that we as an organization relayed to our members is that, and I think the opening package talked to the policemen in the opening package talked about it, that the media's take where it turns it into an us versus them attitude, that's the attitude that we don't need to have. We serve at the pleasure of our community. We serve the communities across the state, whether it's Shreveport, Baton Rouge, New Orleans. We've always, as an organization, asked for a seat at the table for the policy considerations that the mayor's talking about, whether it's on a state level coming out of the legislature to try and figure out a better way. Police officers, overall, for the most part, are part of the communities that they serve in some aspect, one way or the other. I'm from the area that I police and that I policed as a young police officer, and I want to be part of the dialogue that's ongoing in making the improvements or shedding light in helping the community better understand what our job is.
We've been having hearings in the legislature. Just today we had a hearing of the Judiciary Committee, and we spoke about codifying certain practices that we know have been best practices from certain departments here. But I have been very intentional about directing some of what I heard as concerns in the aftermath of Mrs. Sterling's killing. And I have legislation already in the pipeline to address certain things when we talk about the fact that we've had an officer who is now 7 months on paid vacation. A lot of members in the community felt that there should be a time delay on how long do we allow an officer while an investigation is going on to be on paid leave. We're looking at legislation to address that. Immediately after, we know that if there's an officer involved shooting that happens with our sheriff's office, that's not investigated by the sheriff's office. It's investigated by the state police. That should be codified in state law. That shouldn't be a question of if we want to do that. That should be a question of which agency is going to come in. And it's not anti-police. If the police are already doing it, it shows that it's a good practice. That is something that we'll be addressing this upcoming legislative session. And again, I will say that having benefited from listening and sitting across the table from police officers, because a lot of things that I felt in July, I don't feel the same way today when I look at different policies that I think we should enact.
Speaking for the business report, obviously we haven't changed our policy, but the way we have reacted to the incidents of the past 7 months, I think we have tried to be, I think we've tried to approach them with a broader perspective than we maybe would have in the past. We immediately covered, we devoted 2 issues to covering what was going on in the community and tried to give a diversity of perspective. I think one of the very most significant things that we did, Gary, was Rolf McCollister, the publisher and owner of the Business Report, shared his column with you. This is one of the most widely read opinion columns in Baton Rouge, and he's owned that paper for 32 years and never shared that column with anybody. And he gave you half his space. That was very significant. And then just a couple of months later, shared it again with Des Barrow, one of the young entrepreneurs here in the audience tonight that we're going to probably hear from in a few minutes. So I think that went a long way to trying to show the community, not just the business community, but we have to break outside of our comfort zones. We have to do things differently. We want to hear from different people that we've never heard from before, that maybe the business community wasn't open to before. Those are the kind of things that I think we as a publication have done to try to open our eyes and give our readers a broader perspective of what's going on in the community in Baton Rouge.
I wanted to add this while we're talking on this level about a survey that was conducted by the Pew Research Center in September, 2 months following the Alton Sterling shooting. And the study found that there is a racial confidence gap in police performance. So only about 1/3 of blacks, but roughly 3/4 of whites say police in their communities do an excellent job or a good job in using the appropriate force on suspects, treating all racial and ethnic minorities equally and holding officers accountable when misconduct occurs. Roughly half of all blacks, however, say local police do an excellent job or a good job of combating crime, a view that's held by about 8 in 10 whites. The survey also found that blacks are 25 percentage points more likely than whites to say that the deaths of blacks during encounters with police in recent years are signs of a broader societal problem and not merely isolated incidents.
My name is George Bell. I represent Capital Area United Way. And this is a very complex, daunting challenge for our city. And in representing nonprofit organizations, over 50 that operate in and around the Capital area, my question to Mayor Broome is, what role would you like to see the nonprofit community play in addressing this challenge?
Well, that's a easy question for me, because I've often said, and I will be consistent in saying, that if we're going to solve the challenges that we have in our community, even including the gap that often exists between law enforcement and the citizens, it's going to take all stakeholders at the table and actively involved. In one of my inaugural addresses, I said that we need everybody off the bench and in the game. And so the nonprofit sector certainly can play a very active role, whether it's beyond conversations, as we've heard a lot tonight, saying that that's what we need to get beyond, and working even perhaps within their own institutions and organizations. You know, I believe a lot of the change can start in each and every person's individual sphere of influence. Oftentimes I see a lot of organizations that don't reflect the fabric of our community. Good-willed, good-spirited, good intentions, but they don't reflect the fabric of our community, the diversity of our community. And so that's a good place for the nonprofit sector to do a self-evaluation with their own individual organizations.
This city is filled with nonprofits, whether it's businesses or churches or synagogues or temples or fraternal organizations, or you name it. We've got a rich resource in front of us, and I believe a very strong transformative resource. But we've got to bring the very best of what we have. We have to look at all that we've got and figure out how to make what all we've got a whole lot better. And let me just say this. When the floods came in the midst of the summer, after these 2 incidences that we've already talked about, the floods, I think, showed what quality there is in Baton Rouge. People came forth from every sector and they pitched in together. And they showed the very best of what Baton Rouge is capable of. It showed the very best of who we are. We need to keep that fire burning. And I also believe this is a God-given time for us to do something incredible and transformative. And you know something? I believe it can be done.
Before I ask my question, I want to preface it with a interaction that I had with law enforcement. It was actually just as recently as the holiday season. And I was out shopping at the Perkins Road area, and I was dressed like I am now. I was riding a 2015 Altima, brand new car. Didn't even have a permanent tag on the back. I actually had a temp tag in the window. And I was at the red light, and I made a right. I'm pretty sure it was a legal turn, nothing illegal. And I had blue lights flashing behind me, and I was on the headset with a friend of mine while I was making this turn. And I said, man, I think the police is behind me, but I have clear windows, no tint, dressed as I am now. And so I pulled over into the garage right there. And before I can get out, the police officer, get out of the car. And now my heart is literally racing at this moment because I'm like, this is about to be real. I really don't know at this point what's gonna happen to me. And so when I get out of the car, he said, come here, take your headset out. And I'm looking nervous, and he said, why are you looking like that? Because in my mind, I'm thinking about what everybody's saying, it's your pants sagging that gets you with these types of attitudes from the law officers. It's the ghetto vehicle that you're driving and things of that nature. But none of that was the case with myself. That individual, his mind and his heart was made up. And being that his mind and heart was made up and that we can't legislate the heart and the mind, realistically speaking, what can be done to bring about a balance and a peaceful relationship with law enforcement and African-American males like myself?
I think it's about perspective and supervision of officers that are there, whether it's the daily bombardment that we as officers in the community receives from social media, the videos that you see continuously. I think that part of it is that when I was a young policeman, you would see the local newspaper, you might see the 6 o'clock news. There wasn't the constant bombardment of what can go wrong and how quickly it can go wrong. I think it's part of a older supervisor's job, whether it's from the chief down, a lieutenant who's your immediate supervisor, is to be able to have the conversations with the young police officers that there's not a bad man around every corner. It's okay that we have to train and understand that there's a heightened awareness that we all must have because of the incidents that we can come across. But on the other side of it, there's that perspective of that if you revert back to your training and learn more to judge people or have that interaction better. I hate that it happened. I'm glad that you have kept an open mind, that not every law enforcement officer is built the way of the guy that you came across, and I applaud you for that.
I'd like to follow up with Ms. Regal on that question as well. As a young black entrepreneur, or just a young entrepreneur in general, and looking at Baton Rouge as a place to perhaps start their business, and seeing or hearing an incident like this, what type of impact might that have?
Well, I definitely think it has an impact. You know, we unfortunately were branded because of what happened last summer, and that word got out all over the country. And now we have to work that much harder to overcome the stigma. You know, I agree to an extent that there is a narrative out there that's not entirely accurate. And as important as it is to have conversations like this, and I think this is a big first step to overcoming it, to an extent that helps perpetuate the stereotype. You know, I mean, the whole idea about the two Baton Rouges, the North Baton Rouge versus South Baton Rouge, there is a certain amount of truth to that, and yet we transcend that every day. And so I hate to say, well, now we're that much worse off, you know, because of what happened to Des. I mean, I think there are black people and white people and men and women and Hispanics and Asians that work together in this community every day, and that's not to be brushing the problems under the rug. I mean, I definitely think there's a problem that we need to work through, but how bad it is and how much worse is it now, I don't know. I do know that nationally we suffered and took a big hit as a result of that, and our business community is trying to address it. I mean, they stood up immediately after the incident. The business community came together, representatives of the chamber, George Bell was there. They said, we've for a long time been a city too divided, and we admit it, and we have to do more. And they've started to try to take steps to address things like workforce development and education and community development, and to encourage young entrepreneurs to come from around the country. So certainly we have suffered as a result of incidents like that, and incidents like that happened last summer.
I'm Jim Gallagher, Fraternal Order of Police in New Orleans. Mr. Mann came to me earlier, and I asked him to hold off for a while because I didn't think it was appropriate for the question that I had prepared so early in the conversation. But it's important, I believe, that if we're going to understand each other as a community, we hear both sides of the equation. Last year, 108 police officers took their own lives in America. Post-traumatic stress disorder is becoming an increasing problem in law enforcement, and it has to impact, when a police officer is stressed, that it has to have a negative impact on how he deals with his community. What can we do to make mental health assistance more available to police officers? And what can we do to make police officers more amenable to seeking that help?
We have to make mental health treatment available to everybody. And I get that the officers have a very stressful job, and resources are scarce all across the board. However, if we don't address the issue of mental health in our community at large, we're still falling behind the wayside. Here in our community, unfortunately, we just let a large opportunity fall by the wayside in December. And we know that these issues facing law enforcement officers, I will say, as opposed to applying for grants and loans to get riot gear, apply for grants and loans to bring doctors in to help facilitate some of those issues. I would say, instead of additional training in how are we going to respond to potential peaceful protests in our community, let's bring in doctors to help you guys address some of those issues, because we know that they are real. And also, there has to be a recognition that that person that you encounter, that Desmond Barrow, he could be facing some of those same mental issues on that day that you pulled him over. And I think that's and that level of recognition has to be shared. Just as, and I could look at this officer here, and I know all of the ones that are on the wall, and I know them not just because they're in community settings, I know them because they're in the schools. And back to what Des said, that needs to happen more often. It can't just be the Douglas and Thomas at the schools. It needs to be everyone, because that's how you build that relationship, and you are able to have positive experiences that overcome the bias that you saw or you believe to be placed on someone because they are a black male, or because, and I'll say it on the other side, because they're a police officer, because there are some bias and fears that exist on both sides.
Representative James, for the benefit of our statewide viewers who may not be familiar with the election you were referring to on mental health centers, you want to just briefly explain what you're talking about?
Here in Baton Rouge, there was a tax that didn't pass that would have helped us address the large issue of mental health in our community. I think that it was an opportunity that hopefully we'll address again in the near future, but it was something that I believe would have helped us out substantially.
Unfortunately, not only in the police department, which I'm sure it exists in the police department, but as we talk about mental health universally, there is a stigma attached to the recognition that you need mental health. When we talk about health care, we usually think about our physical health, and very little emphasis is put on our mental health or behavioral health. And so I believe that is incumbent also upon the leaders, for example, in departments, the leaders in our police department specifically, to recognize that if this post-traumatic stress is going on, and make sure that the officers get the assistance that they need. But first of all, it has to be destigmatized.
If we would implement or start to looking at what the mayor's talking about of dropping the stigma, and being able to inside of our police departments or our sheriff's departments across the state to be able to have, whether it's maybe I'm not using the right word, not necessarily a crisis intervention counselor, but people that are there, whether it's peer counseling that they're able to reach out to and to share with. And let me tell you what, that expands into the neighborhoods and the communities. If you have officers that are trained in peer counseling and understand how to reach out and see those things, those officers, whether they're serving in the schools, in a school resource officer capacity, whether they're making community meetings, it may give them an extra tool on their tool belt to be able to see this young person or this person has the potential that we maybe need to reach out and intervene to try and get them some of that mental health help that they do need.
Thank you, Chief Pasco. This may be a good time to share some statistics from the Pew Research Center, which surveyed about 8,000 police officers last summer, and the conclusions are very interesting. While about 8 in 10 officers, 58%, said they nearly always or often feel proud about their work, about half, 51%, said it always or often makes them feel frustrated. Officers also report that they encounter a range of reactions from the public. About 8 in 10, 79%, say they have been thanked by a community member for their service in the past month, but 2/3 say they have been verbally abused by a community member during the same time period. Many officers, 55% of them, said that they had both experiences. So some very interesting statistics on the attitudes and experiences of police officers. Now I'll toss it back over to Robin for another question.
I want to give a little context before I ask my question. Local and national media ran the now famous post of Officer Montrell Jackson over and over with the part that said, "Don't let hate infect your heart." But most of them continuously glossed over the part that said, "Out of uniform, some consider me a threat." After watching the services of Officer Gerald and Sheriff Garafola, I was a part of the media team at Living Faith Christian Center that facilitated Officer Jackson's service. What struck me is when the Magnolia Peace Officer Association got up to make a presentation. After watching the previous two, I knew that they weren't at the other two services, and it hit me in my gut. That's the Black Police Officers Association. So as a researcher, when I got home, I Googled it, and I found out that was an association started in Texas because Black law enforcement officers were not allowed to join the police associations in Louisiana, so they went to Texas and chartered a chapter here. So given that we're pushing for unity between the Black and the Blue in all of Baton Rouge, with the existence of separate police unions, how do we get the community to trust the Baton Rouge Police Department without them first healing the divisions within themselves?
I think it comes back to perspective of what are the different associations attempting to do for that officer or for the member of the organization that's there. We try, and I only can speak for my organization. I can't speak for anyone of another organization. We, and as I've been president, have reached out to try and do as much as we can to bridge the unity that we should have. I have reached out, I think, more than any other president that has been before me, where we have not only reached out to Magnolia on my local level, that's there to try and say, let's come together and figure out what we need to do together as a whole instead of as fractured divisions. But you do have some people that are part of all organizations that they don't want to lose their little bit of power, maybe is the best way to say it. And I think you not only see that in police organizations, but you see that in all organizations, that somebody's afraid of what they're going to give up or what they're going to lose. And maybe we need to do a better job organizational-wise as trying to bring the organizations together, because I think the perspective is, for the most part, is the same. While you can't ignore that there's a racial divide in anything that you do. I think it's there because the perspective is different. What you have to do as an organization is I have to try better to understand Representative James's perspective. where he needs to try and better understand my perspective. It's something we can all do better of trying to bridge that gap between them.
In July, my daughter went to protest on that Saturday where they arrested over 200 people, or about 200 people. And at that time, I begged her not to go, but she wanted to do it for her son, for the future of her son or any other children that she has. When they were down there, at this time it was peaceful, and my oldest daughter called and said, "Mom, they got Nisha." I'm like, "What do you mean?" They arrested her. My daughter was not in the street. Nobody was in the street. They were picking people at random times just to arrest. It took 5 men on my 5'4" daughter, put her head in the street and arrested her, yanked her out the crowd and arrested her. I had video of my daughter standing in the crowd and being yanked out by big police officers with her face pressed down in the street. And I have pictures on my phone now where she had bruises all on her face. What can we do to assure that when they go out there and protest for betterment of their lives and their children's lives, what can we do to make sure they are safe?
Mayor Broome?
Yeah. First of all, let me say I'm sorry for what happened to your daughter. Secondly, let me say that I believe peaceful protest is part of the American way. Yes. And I also believe that after I heard of what happened last year, keep in mind that I was not the mayor at that time, but I do believe that everything rises and falls on leadership. And I believe that there are ways that situations can be handled so that there aren't situations like what happened to your daughter, who, as you're sharing with us now, was peacefully protesting. I've been talking to people from around the country, and many of you perhaps have seen some snapshots of different instances around the country where similar situations have happened. For example, I believe it was Oklahoma when there was a killing there of a young man that the police marched with the protesters. So you can imagine that there was a very peaceful protest that took place. So as mayor, it is certainly going to be my objective to make sure that peaceful protests are exactly just that, and that those who serve to protect and serve will do that. I also think that there has to be an understanding, and I've consistently said this too, of mutual respect. I have said that police reform doesn't mean police rejection. It means that we want to transform things so that we have a better department where police and citizens work together.
Thank you, Mayor. Now we'll go back to Robin for a question.
My name is Dawn Powell, and I am with Louisiana Fraternal Order of Police, but I also am a deputy sheriff on the east side of the parish, or east side of the state. And I was just curious, I guess this is more for the representative, if the legislator is willing to work to commit funds for reality-based scenario training for officers.
So, Representative James, we just heard a scenario from a mother.
Yeah.
And how might police have reacted a little bit better given the need for funding?
I'm laughing about funding, not about the question, just the funding piece as we struggle now to fund basic services. I'll tell you that for me, I would be willing to fight for any funding that will improve training for police officers. I believe that with the supplemental pay, I believe that we could do more there for certain officers. But when we have these conversations, we talked a lot about training, and it all goes back to resources. But unfortunately, some of my colleagues don't believe that we need more resources. So as we struggle to fund basic things here in the state, I know based on the folks that I serve with, if law enforcement comes to us with a solid proposal, I think that we'll work to fund some of those things, but it has to be, of course, equity. We've been talking a lot about training, and if those are certain things that our departments would need, I think that there will be a will amongst the body to fund them.
I wanted to add something, if I could, that within the Baton Rouge Police Department, I certainly believe that training has to be, or additional heightened training has to be a priority. And so it has a lot to do with how we shape our priorities and how we shape our budget. And so that is going to be priority as we move forward in the next budget cycle.
My question is to Representative James. First off, I'd like to start by saying that law enforcement is one of the most noble professions there is. Many law enforcement officers have displayed that through the course of their career. Unfortunately, in Black low-income communities, our would-be guardians have assumed the role of warriors. So nationwide, what we have seen, unfortunately, is systematic failure for accountability, as well as for accountability in addition to transparency. I think that's a huge component with everything that's going on here in Baton Rouge, as well as across the nation. So my question to you, Representative James, with all of the mitigating circumstances that take the risk away from poor performance, bad performance by police officers, the policies, the state legislated investigations, the colleague-driven investigations, as well as the officer written reports, how in this environment can we ensure transparency and most importantly accountability for law enforcement officers who do display bad decisions and criminal behavior when it comes to use of force?
You know, I'll tell you that number one, there needs to be a recognition across the entire body that we need to do better with accountability. I don't believe that all of my colleagues get that. I'll tell you, today I got an alert on my phone that we had an officer who was disciplined for shooting a dog. And not to minimize anything for the dog lovers, but we still have an issue that took place down the street, and this guy has been on paid leave. So when things like that happen, that goes a long way to tearing up the trust that we're trying to build, because there seems to be very little accountability there. There seems to be very little fairness there when those issues take place. We have another officer. You saw that the Senate, there was just a discipline against an officer. The Senate, which is a fraternal, a love, a brotherhood, and a sisterhood, when one of the senators stepped out of line, there was discipline there. When some of the officers don't abide by policy, when they violate the law, we need officers to speak up just like other folks speak up. And it's not anti-police, it's all about accountability. If we want to build trust, we have to be able to say, my brother, I love you, but you were wrong, right? You violated policy. That was not good policing. And until we can hear that, until we can do that, it's going to be a very hard time to establish the trust, but it's also going to be hard for us in the legislature to fight to improve these changes, because just even by me saying that now, I guarantee you that there will be some negative comments. I'm going to be anti-police, but it is going to be extremely hard to break down those stigmas, because it is us versus them, and it shouldn't be that way. We should have a procedure in place to where officers who violate practice, procedure, or the law should be disciplined, and that goes a long way to establishing the trust that we all want.
I agree with the representative that no good police officer wants to see another bad police officer stay. I mean, I think that's one of the negative connotations that's been dropped on us for whether it's systematic problems or whatever. But I want to go back and address something that the representative talked about the paid leave. And I guess, you know, and there's always the polar ends of what can happen and what goes wrong. As all you know, that New Orleans is under a federal consent decree, and they're in an allegation-driven system for discipline. So I'm going to give you two examples from the police officer's perspective of where the issues come in. One, there's an allegation going on right now in the city of New Orleans where somebody from Australia was able to call in a complaint of something that was seen on national TV, and this officer is having the full-blown effect of an investigation that's going on from somebody by a telephone complaint from Australia. The second one is that we have an officer that was involved in a shooting in the city of New Orleans. The city came in, complete investigation by the shooting team that the Federal Monitor has in place, and the officer was cleared by the department. But because the DA's office at the time would not make any movement on coming in and saying whether it was a, quote, criminal good shooting or criminal bad shooting at the time, the officer sat on desk duty for about a year and a half, I think, somewhere around there. A lot of times you have officers that are under investigation and the department are for some mitigating circumstance that we have no control over, that maybe someone within the city has no control over because of somebody else that they're waiting on. Is that officer, or whether it's a he or a she, supposed to not have their be able to feed their family of what's going on for something that's completely unrelated? That's the kind of flip side of what's there. And I'll go back to my original statement that's there. No good policeman wants to see it. Whether we need to, I think what the mayor has already addressed through a policy implementation, I think that should be in every department. My department has it, that you're just as responsible to report that as anybody else is.
And speaking of reporting, I want to go to Stephanie Riegel and talk about the media perceptions of these questions. What role does the media play in how the community sees the police department, its protectors, and how maybe that they're not seen as protectors always?
Well, I do have to agree with something that somebody said earlier about the role that, and when I talk about the media, it's not the business report or the Advocate per se, but just the national media and the fact that we live in an era of social media where anytime any single incident happens anywhere in the country, it's all of a sudden a national story. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a tragedy, and that doesn't mean that the officer involved was at fault, but all of a sudden, we're watching it on CNN in the morning when there's one police brutality incident in California or Oklahoma. Why is that a national story any more than any murder in California or Oklahoma is a national story? I really do think that has helped feed this narrative, and I don't think that's a healthy thing. Again, that's not to say that we shouldn't be having these conversations, because there is empirical data that has pointed to problems. It's not just a perception. There are legitimate problems, and data has established that, so it's important to talk about it. But I don't always think the media serves the best interests of society as a whole by blowing, I don't want to say blowing it out of proportion, but playing it to the extent that they do.
What role does that have in the business, for the business community here? Economic development, creation of jobs, when the community gets a reputation that it's not a welcoming place or a safe place to be?
Well, I don't know, and I have not heard evidence that the tragedies that we experienced last summer have affected us negatively. We asked business leaders at the time, we asked people at the chamber, what are you hearing? Certainly it affected the perception, it branded us out there, as I said earlier. I don't know that it has translated into an economic loss per se, but the underlying issues that led to the Alton Sterling shooting in the first place, the underlying issues in this community that have created the kind of economic disparities that underpin everything that we're really talking about tonight, those issues affect us economically, and those are, the education, the crime, and the education again and again and again, and the infrastructure problems that affect people in North Baton Rouge and South Baton Rouge too. Those are the problems that keep companies away. Those are the kind of issues that keep our whole community down. I think that's where the business community, not speaking for them, but just from what I'm hearing, that's what they're trying to address with respect to these issues. They're trying to focus on workforce development, on education, and trying to see where they can better direct those efforts to affect and help the community as a whole, so that we can move beyond these types of issues or address them more effectively.
Mayor, are you aware of the Justice Department's plans for releasing the report on the Alton Sterling shooting? Is there going to be a report? If so, do you have any inkling of when it will be, and what contingencies has the city set forth for whatever may happen when that report is released, if it is released?
So that is the most asked question that I get these days, and I can tell you that nobody knows that date or time. I can also tell you that I believe that there are certainly conversations that are going on between law enforcement and the community to prepare for whatever outcome occurs from the Department of Justice. But I have said, and I will continue to say, that last year, with the advent of the killing of Alton Sterling, that the citizens of this community responded in peaceful protests. Some of the challenges that we had in our community were not from the citizens here in the city and parish of Baton Rouge. And so I am very confident that there will still, whatever side justice comes down on, the Department of Justice, I'll say that there will still be peaceful reactions to what happened. And that doesn't mean that there should not be reactions, but I believe that there will be peaceful, and then I believe that there will be a course of legal action that we have to look at as a city and as a state where we go from whatever decision comes down.
If you look at the statistics in the age groups, it's not us adults getting arrested because we got so much invested in life. It's most of the kids. Have you ever thought about inviting the young kids in and discussing or doing a teen summit only with young kids and the police department so we can get their views across? How we should approach you, this is what we think of what you should do for us, this is what we should do for you. And because there's a big gap and distrust, would that help to get the community back on track?
Okay, I was going to toss this question to Representative James in terms of public safety, but I am going to go back to Deputy Chief Basco.
I'm going to steal his legislative thunder.
Okay.
He spoke earlier about the Judiciary Committee that Representative Katrina Jackson brought together, and when one of the first meetings that we had where she invited law enforcement and community to be involved, that was one of the first things that came up, is that part of driver's education training needs to include law enforcement, not the driving instructor, but local law enforcement with interacting with those driving students that you're hitting at the high school, 14, 15 years old, of telling them, this is what's going to happen if you get stopped by a police officer for speeding. This is the way the interaction is going to take place. This is what you need to do. This is what the law enforcement officer is looking at. I don't know if it was actually determined if they're going to need legislation passed or if that's something that can be done by order of the Secretary of the Department to implement that within the driver's training.
I'll say that over the past 7 months, I've worked a lot with NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and they do a course in schools. Unfortunately, not every student can take that course. However, it does nothing if we teach that course and tell our young people, this is how you respond if we are not having a conversation with our officers and addressing that training. That does absolutely nothing. So it has to be a recognition that there needs to be a two-way thing. When these things happened this summer, we heard about, I was there, I didn't have to hear about it. I was there on the ground when protests happened. Only one group had the necessary training to deal with those things, and it wasn't the young people, right? Those young people, of course, they weren't trained. They didn't know, they were upset, they were mad, they were out there, they were frustrated. But you have another segment that were supposed to be trained to deal with that. So we cannot address this problem by only looking at young people and trying to talk to them and tell them how to approach if we don't address the actual approach.
Dr. Jose Torres with Louisiana State University. I'm a former public housing community police officer from Norfolk Police Department in Norfolk, Virginia. Like most officers, I quit. I pursued my PhD. I'm now at LSU where I'm teaching a course on policing and race. I invite you all to come. My first question is for the mayor. What role do you see universities playing in your efforts to drive change? Second question, I'll preface by saying often low-income communities get stigmatized for not speaking out on crime-related issues to police, sharing information and things of that nature. What efforts are going to be made to make sharing of information easier for residents who are fearful of sharing information with police? I know that as a community police officer, this was a great tool that I had. The community residents spoke to me on my community-issued work cell phone whenever they wanted to. Working when I was not working, it led to the biggest drug bust on the street, all because a concerned citizen trusted us and shared that information from a cell phone.
So
So two things. First of all, I would love to know more about your class, because I think perhaps what is taking place in your class can be practically applied to some of the initiatives that take place in our community. And so I don't want to answer a question with a question, but I would say, based on the scenario that you just shared with us, that you had developed some relationship with those individuals in that community, which is why they trusted you and why they reached out to you. Am I right on that?
100%, absolutely.
Okay. So that goes back to the whole concept of community policing, and not community policing as a program, but community policing as an integral part of the whole behavior of a police department. That community policing is the culture of a department, not where people just go out once and twice and you have different officers, but I'm looking for community policing to have tentacles in all areas of our community, just like we have precincts in all areas of our community. That's how we get people in the community involved in the whole equation of public safety and working with the police department. You said it, it's all about trust.
The first part of Professor Walter's question, though, was also about
the university.
Yeah, and maybe how are we using the resources that our universities are developing, and especially someone like him who has experience as an officer?
Yeah, well, I would probably say, Bob, maybe we are not using our universities as much as we should as we work out this whole issue of even community policing or closing the gap between law enforcement and the community. So I look forward to having conversations with our institutions of higher education, both Southern and LSU and even BRCC, to see what we can come up with to add value to what is taking place.
Thank you, Mayor. We want to thank you all for being here tonight. This has been a very enlightening and interesting conversation that we've had, and we appreciate everyone's participation, especially our panelists, Father Andrus, Mayor President Broom, Deputy Chief Basco, Representative James, and Ms. Regal for their input on tonight's topic. We would love to hear from you in our TV audience. Please comment about this program by visiting our website at lpb.org/Public Square. And we want to also thank our audience tonight for their great participation, and special thanks to Reverend Raymond Jetson and and everybody at Star Hill Church for opening up their beautiful sanctuary to us tonight. We appreciate the warm welcome that we received. Thank you and good night.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.